When one looks at the United States in the mid-19th century, one recognizes a country that was divided into two completely different worlds, not only geographically, but also economically, socially, and morally. In the industrialized North, factories, railroads, and cities grew at a rapid pace. Here, an economy based on wage labor, technological progress, and international trade relations dominated. Many people in the northern states rejected slavery not only for moral reasons, but also saw it as an obstacle to economic modernization and social progress. Abolitionist movements, supported by intellectuals, clergy, and activists, found an increasing audience in the northern states and anchored the idea that the United States should be a nation of freedom, although initially mostly from the perspective of the free white population. In the South, however, a completely different economic and social order shaped life. The plantation economy, especially the cultivation of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane, was the backbone of the Southern economy. This highly profitable agricultural system relied entirely on the labor of enslaved African Americans, whose exploitation secured the economic prosperity of a small but powerful planter elite. For this social class, slavery was not only an economic necessity, but also an integral part of their cultural identity. Many Southern politicians argued that slavery was willed by God and a civilizing institution, a belief they defended with great zeal. These contrasts were not just disagreements about forms of labor, but deeply rooted conflicts over the nation's self-understanding. While the North increasingly developed a vision of the United States as a modern, free, and united industrial nation, the Southern states clung to an agrarian, hierarchical, and slavery-based social model. The political arena became a constant stage for this confrontation. Every new territorial expansion, every decision about the status of a state, and every debate in Congress threatened to destroy the fragile balance between the two camps. Over time, not only the ideological gap grew, but also the mistrust. In the North, people feared the political power of the slaveholder party and its attempts to extend the institution of slavery into new territories. In the South, abolitionists were seen as an existential threat to their own economic survival and social order. These irreconcilable differences prepared the ground for a series of political compromises, crises, and laws that ultimately paved the way for the Civil War. The slavery question was not just a single political issue, but the central crack that ran through the foundation of the Union and ultimately threatened to shatter it. Missouri Compromise. In the year 1820, the young American Republic faced a delicate question that shook the nation's political fabric. Should slavery be allowed in the newly emerging states or not? The trigger for this controversy was Missouri's application to join the Union. Since Missouri allowed slavery, many in the North feared that its admission would tip the fragile balance between free and slave-holding states in the Senate in favor of the South. This balance was of central importance to both sides, as it had so far prevented one region from imposing its political views on the other. The debate in Congress was heated and dragged on for months. For the Southern states, it was unthinkable that the federal government could dictate what their social order should look like. For the Northern states, however, the expansion of slavery into new territories was morally unacceptable and politically dangerous. Finally, a compromise was reached, which went down in history as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri was allowed to be admitted to the Union as a slave state, but at the same time, the northern state of Maine joined as a free state. This kept the number of free and slave-holding states in the Senate balanced. A second crucial component of this compromise was a geographical line that would henceforth serve as a dividing line for the slavery issue in the Western territories. North of this line, slavery was to be prohibited; south of it, allowed, with the exception of Missouri itself. This regulation was intended to avoid future conflicts by drawing a clear territorial boundary. Indeed, the Missouri Compromise gave the Union a temporary respite. It was considered a diplomatic success that postponed the looming break between North and South for several decades. But beneath the surface, the antagonisms continued to smolder. The geographical dividing line was ultimately just a bandage on an ever-deepening wound. Later territorial expansions, economic changes, and the growing influence of abolitionist movements would increasingly put the compromise under pressure until it finally collapsed dramatically in the 1850s. Fugitive Slave Act. In the year 1850, the conflict over the slavery issue reached a new level of intensity, not on the battlefields but in the courtrooms at the borders of the states and in the streets of the cities. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of the so-called Compromise of 1850, was intended at first glance to create a clear practical regulation. It obligated not only the authorities but also private individuals in all states, even in the free ones, to return escaped slaves to their owners in the South. Anyone who did not cooperate or even provided assistance could be punished with heavy fines and imprisonment. What was presented as a legal measure quickly developed into a moral and political powder keg. For the Southern states, this law was a triumph, proof that their property rights were respected even beyond the borders of their own states. For many people in the North, however, it was a direct attack on their fundamental values and their regional self-determination. Now, slave catchers could legally enter northern cities, arrest African Americans, whether escaped or free-born, and deport them to the South without due process. This new reality had dramatic consequences. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, or Chicago, there were furious protests, violent rescue operations, and public trials where abolitionists tried to prevent the return of the fugitives. The Underground Railroad, a secret network of escape helpers, intensified its activities, and many escaped slaves no longer sought refuge only in the North but fled further to Canada, where the U.S. law did not apply. The Fugitive Slave Act literally brought slavery to the doorstep of many Northerners who had previously viewed the institutional violence primarily as a problem of the South. Now they were legally required to participate in a practice they deeply condemned morally. Instead of diffusing the conflict, as the Compromise of 1850 had intended, the law exacerbated the tensions between the sections of the country. It contributed to the further hardening of the fronts and made it increasingly clear that the slavery issue could no longer be resolved through political compromises. Kansas-Nebraska Act. In the middle of the decade before the Civil War, a law came into force that further destabilized the already fragile political balance between the North and South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Officially, this law was only intended to regulate the organization of new territories in the West, Kansas and Nebraska, but its real explosiveness lay in a momentous provision. The question of whether slavery should be allowed in these territories or not was to be decided by the settlers themselves through votes. This principle of popular sovereignty was a clear break with the previous regulation of the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36°30 parallel. Proponents of the law, led by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, argued, "This solution is democratic and decides the question where it matters most, with the settlers themselves." Opponents, however, warned that this would open the door for an unlimited expansion of slavery. Indeed, the new regulation attracted not only pioneers and fortune seekers to the land, but also political activists and militant groups determined to influence the future fate of the territories in their favor. The result was an outbreak of open violence. The attempt at political self-determination turned into a small-scale civil war. In Kansas, armed pro-slavery militias from Missouri marched in to manipulate election results, while abolitionists from the North came in droves to force the establishment of a free state. The consequence was a series of brutal attacks, looting, and massacres that soon became known as Bleeding Kansas. Entire settlements were burned down, political opponents were murdered, and the territory sank into a vortex of retaliation and chaos. The Kansas-Nebraska Act proved to be a political catalyst. It destroyed trust in cross-regional compromises, split old parties like the Whigs, and led to the formation of a new political force, the Republican Party, which clearly positioned itself against the expansion of slavery. The law, which was supposed to promote self-determination, instead brought violence, destabilization, and a further hardening of ideological fronts. Kansas thus became a dark harbinger of what would engulf the entire country a few years later, an open, bloody conflict between two irreconcilable social models. Dred Scott decision. When the Supreme Court of the United States announced its verdict in the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857, it shook the landscape like a thunderclap. The plaintiff, Dred Scott, was an enslaved African American who had lived for years in free territories and subsequently sued for his freedom. The case offered the opportunity to clarify the slavery question through legal means, but the decision of the highest court dramatically intensified the tensions instead of diffusing them. In a 7-2 majority, the court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, declared that African Americans, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved, could not be considered citizens of the United States. Consequently, they had no right to sue in federal courts. But that was not all. The court also ruled that Congress had no constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This finding effectively meant the repeal of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and opened the possibility for slavery to expand into all new territories. For the slaveholders in the South, this was a legal triumph, a confirmation that their institution was not only legal but constitutionally protected. In the North, however, the verdict triggered outrage and horror. Abolitionists saw it as proof that the federal institutions were dominated by the interests of the slaveholders. Newspapers, churches, and political assemblies attacked the verdict as a moral scandal that mocked the principles of the Declaration of Independence and Republican ideals. The Dred Scott decision did far more than decide a single legal dispute. It took away the hope of legal equality from those African Americans who were already free, and made it unmistakably clear that the federal Constitution, at least in the court's interpretation, protected slavery, not fought it. This further fueled an already simmering conflict. The verdict contributed significantly to the silencing of moderate voices on the slavery issue and pushed the political debate into more radical channels. Another step on the path to the inevitable Civil War. Election of Abraham Lincoln. The autumn of the year 1860 marked a political turning point unlike any the United States had experienced before. The presidential election of that year was far more than a regular transfer of power. It was a decisive battle over the future of the nation. At the center of this conflict stood Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown lawyer and politician from Illinois who had risen from the regional stage to a national figure within a few years. Lincoln embodied the principles of the Republican Party, which had been formed only a few years earlier in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Its central platform was to prevent the expansion of slavery into new territories, but not to immediately abolish the institution in the existing southern states. The election campaign took place against the backdrop of an increasingly fractured political landscape. The formerly dominant parties of the USA had disintegrated or were deeply divided. The Democratic Party, traditionally strong in both the South and the North, broke into two camps. The Northern Democrats under Stephen A. Douglas, who favored a policy of popular sovereignty, and the Southern Democrats under John C. Breckinridge, who demanded a constitutional guarantee of slavery in all territories. In addition, there was the Constitutional Union Party under John Bell, which tried to diffuse the conflict by focusing on the unity of the Union and adherence to the Constitution, without taking a clear position on slavery. In this fragmented political arena, Lincoln skillfully exploited the divisions. While he hardly campaigned in the South and found virtually no support there, he managed to rally the northern states almost unanimously behind him. His clear stance against the expansion of slavery, coupled with a message of national unity and economic modernization, such as through railroad expansion, protectionist measures for industry, and the promotion of education programs, appealed to broad segments of the electorate in the North. Lincoln won the election with only about 40% of the popular vote nationwide, but secured a clear majority in the Electoral College thanks to the majority of votes in the populous northern states. For the South, Lincoln's victory was a shock and, in the eyes of many plantation owners, a political writing on the wall. Although Lincoln had repeatedly stressed that he wanted to leave slavery untouched in the existing Southern states, his election was considered by many there as the beginning of an irreversible development. The political influence of the slaveholders was waning, and a government dominated by their opponents would now set the course for the nation. Lincoln's election acted as a catalyst for those forces that had been openly or secretly considering secession from the Union for years. In the weeks following the election, political developments spiraled. Even before Lincoln was officially inaugurated in March 1861, several Southern states declared their secession from the Union, a step that would lead to open war a few months later. Thus, Lincoln's election was not just the beginning of a new presidency, but the trigger for one of the deepest national crises in American history. From the perspective of historians, this election victory stands on the threshold between the last fragile peace and the unavoidable path to the Civil War. An election that divided a nation and changed the world. Secession of the Southern states. The months between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and the spring of 1861 were among the most dramatic phases in American history. Scarcely was the election result known when heated debates began in the Southern states about whether remaining in the Union under a Republican president was still possible or desirable. For many leading politicians and plantation owners in the South, Lincoln's victory was the clear sign that the political dominance of the slaveholding class was broken, and that the northern states would henceforth determine the country's direction. Although Lincoln repeatedly declared that he would not touch slavery in the existing states, this was considered not very credible in the South. The deep fear of a gradual undermining of their own social system and economic foundation drove the secession movement forward with unprecedented speed. The first state to make the break was South Carolina, which announced its declaration of secession on December 20, 1860. Within a few weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. These 7 states formed the Confederate States of America in February 1861, with a provisional capital in Montgomery, Alabama. At its head was Jefferson Davis, an experienced politician and former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, who was elected president of the new Confederacy. The new government was largely based on the Constitution of the United States, but added explicit guarantees for the institution of slavery. Secession was more than just a political act. It was a direct attack on the idea of an indissoluble union. The Southern states justified their step with the doctrine of states' rights, according to which each state had the right to leave the Union if the federal government exceeded its constitutional limits. In their eyes, Lincoln's election had signaled exactly this, the beginning of a government that threatened their way of life and their property rights. In the North, the secession triggered shock, outrage, and helplessness. It was still unclear whether the remaining states would risk a war to hold the Union together by force. Many hoped for negotiations or a new form of compromise. But when in the spring of 1861 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy after the outbreak of initial hostilities, it was clear that the division was deepening. The founding of the Confederate States marked the official end of the political unity that had existed since the Declaration of Independence in 1776. What began as a reaction to an election developed within a few months into a complete separation and the formation of a separate nation, at least from the South's perspective. From the perspective of the federal government in Washington, however, it was a rebellion that could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The secession laid the foundation for the inevitable military conflict that would soon follow, a war that would be fought not just for territories but for the soul and self-understanding of the United States. Attack on Fort Sumter. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1861, the first cannon shots lit up the harbor entrance of Charleston, South Carolina, and with them began the American Civil War. The target of the bombardment was Fort Sumter, a fortress built on an artificial island that controlled the entrance to the harbor. Although the structure was located in a state that had already joined the Confederacy, it was still occupied by U.S. troops. This symbol of federal presence in the heart of the South was a constant provocation for the new Confederate government. The situation had escalated dramatically in the preceding months. Since the secession of South Carolina in December 1860, Major Robert Anderson, commander of the Union garrison, found himself in an increasingly hopeless position. Originally stationed at Fort Moultrie, he had secretly moved his men to Fort Sumter for strategic reasons, an action that was considered a hostile act by the Southern states. Supplying the fortress proved difficult as Confederate troops under General P.G.T. Beauregard blocked the accesses and prevented any reinforcement from the north. President Abraham Lincoln, in office only since March 1861, now faced a difficult decision. Either he let the fortress be abandoned and risked showing weakness, or he tried to supply it and thus provoke a military confrontation. Lincoln chose a middle path. He publicly announced that he would send only food, not weapons or additional soldiers. But for the Confederate leadership in Montgomery, this was an unacceptable situation. On April 11, they demanded Anderson's unconditional surrender. When he refused, they gave the order to fire. For 36 hours, shells and cannonballs rained down on Fort Sumter. The defenders held out, but without sufficient ammunition, and given the hopeless situation, Anderson ordered the surrender on April 13. Remarkably, there were no fatalities during the fighting. The only injuries and deaths occurred during the evacuation, when an accident during a salute ceremony struck several men. Despite the low number of casualties, the attack on Fort Sumter had enormous political explosive force. In the North, it triggered a storm of outrage. Lincoln's call for the mobilization of 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion led previously hesitant Southern states like Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina to join the Confederacy. The last shred of hope for a peaceful solution was gone. A political crisis had turned into an open war. Fort Sumter was thus far more than just the place where the first shots were fired. It was the symbolic point of no return that plunged the United States into a 4-year conflict in which two irreconcilable visions of the country met on the battlefields. From now on, there would be no more negotiations. From now on, there would be fighting. First Battle of Bull Run. When the first major armies of the Union and the Confederacy faced each other in the summer of 1861, the illusion still prevailed on both sides that the war could be short and victorious. Many people in the North, as in the South, believed that a single major battle would be enough to force the enemy to give up its position. In this climate of overconfidence and nationalist fervor, the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as the Battle of Manassas, the first major engagement of the American Civil War, took place on July 21, 1861. The encounter was to have not only military but above all psychological effects, and convince both sides of the reality of a long, bloody conflict. The Union troops under the command of Brigadier General Irvin McDowell moved south from Washington, D.C. with the aim of defeating the Confederate forces under General P.G.T. Beauregard near the strategically important railroad junction of Manassas in Virginia. The plan was bold but poorly prepared. McDowell's army consisted largely of inexperienced volunteers who had been enlisted only a few weeks earlier. Nevertheless, the political leadership in Washington pushed for a quick advance to demonstrate the Union's determination to the public and to foreign countries. On the morning of the battle, McDowell attacked the Confederate lines along Bull Run Creek and initially made territorial gains. The Confederates fell back, seeming to be in disarray. But reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston, arriving by railroad from the Shenandoah Valley, turned the tide. The steadfast resistance of the brigade under General Thomas J. Jackson, who later earned the nickname Stonewall, played a decisive role. Jackson's men held a key position against repeated Union attacks and gave the Southerners the opportunity to launch a counteroffensive. By afternoon, the Union front began to waver. The inexperienced soldiers, exhausted by heat and thirst, began to retreat in disorder. Soon, the orderly retreat turned into a panicked flight as rumors of advancing Confederate cavalry unsettled the ranks. The chaotic scene was exacerbated by the fact that numerous spectators from Washington, including politicians, journalists, and even families, had visited the battlefield to witness the great victory. Now their carriages and wagons mingled with the fleeing troops, turning the retreat into a complete mess. The casualties were low compared to later battles, around 2,900 men on the Union side, about 2,000 on the Confederate side, but the psychological impact was enormous. For the South, the victory was a moral triumph and proof that the new nation could compete militarily with the Union. In the North, however, the defeat triggered shock and disillusionment. The dream of a short war was shattered. The realization set in that it would take months, perhaps years, to defeat the South. The First Battle of Bull Run fundamentally changed the perception of the war. It made clear that neither bravery nor patriotic exuberance could replace a lack of training, logistical planning, and strategic foresight. For both sides, the battle was a harsh but necessary teacher and the prelude to a long, merciless struggle that would shake the country to its core. Battle of Antietam. September 1862 brought a turning point in the Civil War that was of enormous importance both militarily and politically. After a series of successes in the East, the Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee decided to invade Union territory for the first time. This advance into Maryland was intended to achieve several goals. On the one hand, Lee hoped to demoralize the war-weary northern states with a victory on their own soil and perhaps persuade them to peace negotiations. On the other hand, he wanted to use the harvest season in war-torn Virginia to supply his troops in the North. A success would also have increased the chances that European powers like Great Britain or France would diplomatically recognize the Confederacy. The Union Army under General George B. McClellan gained a decisive advantage through a fortunate coincidence. Near Frederick, Maryland, a soldier found 3 cigars, in the paper of which a copy of Lee's detailed battle plan was wrapped. McClellan now knew that Lee's army was divided to pursue different objectives and recognized the unique opportunity to strike. Nevertheless, he hesitated, as so often in his career, and gave Lee valuable time to concentrate his forces near the small town of Sharpsburg on Antietam Creek. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the battle began. The fighting first erupted in the northern part of the battlefield, where Union troops repeatedly tried to break Lee's left flank. Places like the cornfield, the West Woods, and the sunken road, later known as Bloody Lane, became the scene of fierce close-quarters combat where thousands of men fell in a confined space. Despite temporary territorial gains, the Northerners failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. In the southern part of the battlefield, Union soldiers met stubborn resistance at the Antietam Bridge, which was held by a small but fiercely fighting Confederate force. Only after hours of attacks could the Union troops secure the crossing. The fighting lasted the entire day without either side being able to achieve a clear military victory, but the losses were unprecedented. Around 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in a single day, the highest casualty count in the history of the United States for a single battle. In the evening, Lee held his position, but given the exhaustion of his army and the precarious supply situation, he withdrew across the Potomac during the night. Politically, President Lincoln used the opportunity to portray Lee's retreat as a strategic success for the Union. This moment provided him with the basis to publish a long-planned document, the Emancipation Proclamation. By officially linking the war with the goal of liberating the slaves in the rebelling states, Lincoln gave the conflict a clear moral dimension and made it more difficult for European powers to support the slave-holding republic in the South. The Battle of Antietam remained a turning point in several respects. Militarily, it showed that Lee's advance to the north could be stopped, even if the Union missed the opportunity to decisively destroy his army. Politically, it gave weight to expanding the war with an ideological component. At the same time, it revealed the horrifying brutality of the conflict and made the hope for a quick peace fade further away. Antietam Creek thus became a symbol of both the blood toll and the strategic decisions that would determine the further course of the war. Emancipation Proclamation. New Year's Day of the year 1863 marked a historic turning point that radiated far beyond the borders of the United States. On this day, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation came into effect, a document that declared all slaves in the areas in rebellion to be henceforth free. But this moment was not the result of a sudden decision, but the result of a long political, military, and moral development within the Civil War. When Lincoln was elected president, he had emphasized that his goal was not the immediate abolition of slavery in the existing southern states, but the prevention of its expansion. He wanted to preserve the Union, not fight a war for complete emancipation. But the longer the war lasted, the clearer it became that slavery itself was the heart of the conflict. It was not only the moral and political dividing line between North and South, but also a crucial economic and military factor for the Confederacy. Millions of enslaved African Americans worked in the fields, in workshops, and as auxiliary forces for the Southern Army. Their labor directly supported the war efforts of the rebels. Lincoln had already begun to consider a proclamation in the summer of 1862 that would abolish slavery in the rebellious territories. Militarily, it was intended to weaken the Confederacy by depriving it of its workforce. Politically, it was intended to clearly place the war on the side of the moral cause of freedom. In foreign policy, Lincoln hoped to prevent Great Britain and France, where public opinion was predominantly against slavery, from diplomatically recognizing or supporting the South. But Lincoln did not want to take this step during a phase of military defeats, so as not to give the impression of acting out of desperation. It was only after the retreat of the Confederates after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 that he saw the right moment. In the same month, he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. If the rebellious states did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, their slaves would be declared free. When that day finally came, Lincoln signed the final document. It declared that all persons held as slaves in the Confederate territories were henceforth free, and that the federal government, including the Army and Navy, would recognize and enforce this freedom. Although the proclamation did not apply to slaves in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union or in already occupied areas of the South, its symbolic and practical effect was enormous. Overnight, the war officially became a fight for the abolition of slavery. For many African Americans in the South, the proclamation was a signal to flee. Tens of thousands sought refuge behind the lines of the Union Army. And soon black regiments like the famous 54th Massachusetts began to fight for their freedom on the front lines. Abroad, Lincoln's step was received with respect and admiration, especially in Great Britain, where public opinion now turned even more clearly against any possible support for the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation fundamentally changed the moral basis of the war. It not only gave the North a higher purpose, but also anchored the idea that the preservation of the Union and the end of slavery were inextricably linked. Thus, it became one of the most decisive political acts in the history of the United States and a document whose echo was felt long after the end of the Civil War. Battle of Gettysburg. The summer of 1863 brought one of the most famous and decisive confrontations of the American Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg. It was not only the largest battle ever fought on North American soil, but also a turning point that changed the strategic balance of the entire war. Since the spring, the Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee had been at the height of its self-confidence. After the impressive victory at Chancellorsville, Lee had decided to advance into Union territory a second time to move the war out of the devastated regions of Virginia, to procure urgently needed supplies, and to influence public opinion in the North in favor of a peace settlement. A clear victory on enemy territory might also have favored the hoped-for diplomatic recognition by European powers. At the end of June, Lee's troops marched through Maryland into Pennsylvania. Facing them was the Union Army under General George G. Meade, who had taken command only a few days before the battle. The encounter of both armies on July 1st near the small town of Gettysburg was initially accidental. Vanguards of both sides clashed, and a skirmish quickly developed into a large-scale battle. On the first day, the Confederates managed to push the Union troops out of the town after heavy fighting and back onto the nearby hills, Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. The second day, July 2nd, brought fierce attacks on the flanks of the Union position. Places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, and the Peach Orchard became the scene of intense close-quarters combat. The heroic efforts of the 20th Maine under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who defended a crucial position on Little Round Top and finally repelled the attackers with a bayonet charge, later became legendary. Despite heavy losses, the Union managed to hold its lines. On July 3rd, Lee risked everything on one card. He ordered a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge, an attack that went down in history as Pickett's Charge. After a tremendous artillery barrage, around 12,500 Confederate soldiers marched across open ground, only to be broken under devastating defensive fire. The attack failed and the remnants of the troops retreated, defeated. Lee's army had to begin its retreat to Virginia on July 4th. Weakened and without the hoped-for breakthrough, the Battle of Gettysburg exacted a terrible price. Around 51,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The losses hit the South particularly hard, as it could hardly replace its numerically inferior army. For the North, the victory was an enormous moral boost. In conjunction with the almost simultaneous capture of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, it solidified the Union's strategic upper hand. Gettysburg became a symbol not only because of its military outcome. It henceforth stood for the moment when the advance of the Confederacy was definitively stopped. Months later, Lincoln gave this place an additional historical and moral significance with his Gettysburg Address by defining the war as a test of the nation's democratic principles. Thus, Gettysburg remained in memory as a place of blood, but also as a decisive step towards the victory of the Union. Capture of Vicksburg. In the summer of 1863, a campaign unfolded on the Mississippi whose strategic importance can hardly be overestimated: the capture of Vicksburg. This city in western Mississippi was considered the Gibraltar of the South, an almost impregnable fortress perched high above a bend in the river, controlling ship traffic on the Mississippi. For the Confederacy, Vicksburg was of crucial importance, because not only did important trade and supply lines run through this waterway, but also the connection between the eastern and western states of the rebels. As long as Vicksburg remained in Confederate hands, the South could control the river and secure supplies from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The Union recognized early that control of the Mississippi was a central goal of the so-called Anaconda Plan, which aimed to economically strangle the South. The command of the operation was given to General Ulysses S. Grant, who had already made a name for himself through successes in the Western theater of war. The road to Vicksburg, however, was long and difficult. Grant tried several times in vain to approach the city, whether through direct attacks, flanking maneuvers, or the construction of canals to bypass the fortress's heavy guns. It was not until the spring of 1863 that he succeeded with a bold plan. He had his troops march south past Vicksburg, cross them to the opposite bank of the Mississippi, and cut the city off from the land side. In a series of engagements, including the battles at Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, and Champion Hill, he drove the Confederate troops under General John C. Pemberton back into the fortifications of Vicksburg. On May 18, the siege began. For weeks, the defenders were beset by artillery bombardment and attacks, while the civilian population was forced to live in caves to protect themselves from the shells. Hunger and disease spread and supplies ran out. On July 4, 1863, just one day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, Vicksburg capitulated. The surrender marked not only the end of a long and grueling siege, but also a strategic breakthrough for the Union. The Mississippi now flowed unhindered from north to south under the control of the northern states, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. The western states were cut off from the east, and the supply lines of the southern states were permanently weakened. The simultaneous victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 fundamentally changed the course of the war. While Gettysburg halted the Confederate advance in the east, Vicksburg deprived the South of a vital strategic connection and dealt it an economic blow from which it would not recover. For Grant, the success meant his definitive rise to one of the most important generals of the war, which later brought him to the head of all Union armies. For the Confederacy, however, the loss of Vicksburg was a bitter turning point. The proud Gibraltar of the South had fallen, and with it, another part of the hope for a victory in the war for independence faded. Sherman's march to the sea. In the autumn of 1864, one of the most famous and at the same time most controversial campaigns of the American Civil War began. Lieutenant General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea. This campaign marked a turning point in warfare because it left the front line and was specifically directed against the economic and logistical foundations of the Confederacy. The idea was radical. Instead of exclusively fighting enemy armies, the civilian infrastructure of the South was to be destroyed in order to break the enemy's ability to wage war and to drive its population to resignation. Sherman had already distinguished himself as a close ally of Ulysses S. Grant and as a capable strategist. After the successful capture of Atlanta in September 1864, an important industrial and railroad hub, he faced the decision of whether to pursue the Confederate General John Bell Hood further north or to push deep into the heart of Georgia. Sherman chose the latter. He wanted to shatter the South from within by destroying the vital transportation routes, crops, stockpiles, and production facilities. This corresponded to a form of total warfare that was previously unknown in the United States to this extent. On November 15, 1864, Sherman left Atlanta with about 60,000 soldiers and set off towards Savannah on the Atlantic coast, about 480 km away. He deliberately dispensed with a secured supply line. His army lived off what it could procure along the way. In the process, the soldiers not only plundered food and livestock, but also burned down barns, factories, mills, and railway stations. Railroad tracks were heated and bent so that they became unusable. The infamous Sherman's Neckties. These destructions affected not only military targets but also the civilian population, which deepened the hatred of Sherman in the South long after the war ended. The march proceeded largely unhindered, as the Confederate forces were too weak to face Sherman's numerically superior and mobile troops. The psychological effect was as great as the material one. Whole communities found themselves powerless against the advancing army, and confidence in the Confederacy's ability to protect its citizens waned. On December 21, 1864, Sherman reached Savannah, which was surrendered without a fight. In a telegram to President Lincoln, he offered him the city as a Christmas present, a symbolic triumph that boosted morale in the North. Sherman's march to the sea had profound consequences. It destroyed large parts of Georgia's economic power and contributed decisively to undermining the resource base of the South. At the same time, it demonstrated that the Union was able to operate unhindered in the core territory of the Confederacy. The tactic of scorched earth was brutal but effective. It accelerated the collapse of resistance and ushered in the final year of the war, in which the South was increasingly pushed onto the defensive. Historians see Sherman's campaign as an early example of modern warfare, in which not only armies but entire societies are targeted to break the political will to fight. Lincoln's re-election. November 1864 brought an election that in many ways took place under extraordinary circumstances. The United States was in the midst of the fourth year of a devastating civil war, the outcome of which was not yet finally decided at that time. The presidential election thus became a referendum on Abraham Lincoln's leadership, his war strategy, and the future direction of the nation. Rarely before had an election had such a direct impact on the course of an ongoing conflict. At the beginning of the election year, Lincoln's re-election seemed by no means certain. The continuing high losses on the battlefields, the slow advance of the Union troops, and the deep war weariness in the North had caused his popularity to decline. Within his own Republican Party, there was dissatisfaction. And in public, voices grew louder demanding a negotiated peace with the South, even if it meant maintaining slavery. The Democratic Party nominated George B. McClellan, a former commander-in-chief of the Union Army, a candidate who enjoyed high esteem in the North. Although McClellan personally advocated for the continuation of the war, his party adopted a platform that promised peace negotiations, a signal to war-weary voters. However, the political climate changed decisively in the late summer and autumn of 1864. Several military successes changed the perception of the war in the North. The capture of Atlanta by General William T. Sherman in September demonstrated that the Union was capable of delivering deep blows to the heart of the Confederacy. At the same time, General Philip Sheridan's troops achieved decisive victories in the Shenandoah Valley, thereby losing an important source of supply for the South. These successes strengthened Lincoln's argument that a military victory was within reach and that a change of leadership would jeopardize what had been achieved. Lincoln himself did not run with the usual party apparatus but formed a so-called National Union Party, which also included moderate Democrats. As a vice presidential candidate, he chose Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union, a clear symbol of the possibility of national reconciliation after the war. His message to the voters was clear. The Union must be preserved at all costs, and the war must be fought until the rebellion was finally crushed. On November 8, 1864, the voters gave Lincoln a clear mandate. He won with about 55% of the popular vote and an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College, 212 to 21 against McClellan. The victory was not only a personal affirmation for Lincoln, but also a political signal to the Confederacy that the North was not willing to make compromises at the expense of its war aims. The election showed that despite all the sacrifices, the determination to fight the war to complete victory still existed in the North. The re-election of Lincoln ensured the continuity of the war effort at a crucial phase of the conflict. It gave the generals in the field the confidence that their efforts would not be undermined by a political change of course, and prepared the ground for the last decisive campaigns of 1865. At the same time, it strengthened the president's position to shape the reconstruction of the country after the war, a task for which, however, he would only have a few more months. Siege of Petersburg and Richmond. The Siege of Petersburg and the subsequent fall of Richmond between June 1864 and April 1865 formed the last major and decisive phase of the American Civil War in the East. After the bitter and costly overland campaign, General Ulysses S. Grant, the commander-in-chief of all Union armies, had realized that a quick victory over Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was not achievable. Instead, he opted for a strategy of attrition. He wanted to tie down the Confederates in a war of position, cut their supply lines, and thus slowly deprive them of the ability to resist. The main target became the railroad city of Petersburg, an important logistical hub through which Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, was supplied with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. In June 1864, the Union began several attacks on the defensive lines around Petersburg, but Lee's troops, though outnumbered, held their ground. Grant therefore decided to encircle and besiege the city. Over months, the network of trenches, forts, and fortifications on both sides grew into a complex system that in some respects foreshadowed the trench warfare of the First World War. Time and again, the Union tried to sever the Confederacy's supply lines through targeted operations. A particularly famous, though ultimately failed attempt was the Crater Attack in July 1864, in which Union soldiers blew up a tunnel under the enemy lines but could not successfully exploit the resulting breach. The winter of 1864 brought no decision, but the situation for the Confederates worsened steadily. The supply situation in Richmond and Petersburg became increasingly precarious, food became scarce, and the morale of the population as well as the soldiers sank. Sherman's march through Georgia and the subsequent destruction of further southern supply routes intensified the pressure. Lee's army suffered from desertion, and reinforcements of men or material were hardly possible anymore. In the spring of 1865, Grant launched the decisive offensive. At the end of March and beginning of April, Union troops succeeded in capturing important supply lines like the South Side Railroad. On April 2, the Union lines finally broke through and Lee's defense became untenable. On the same day, the evacuation of Richmond began. President Jefferson Davis and his government fled, while Confederate troops and authorities tried to take as much material as possible with them or to destroy it so that it would not fall into enemy hands. On April 3, Union soldiers marched into Richmond, a symbolic and psychological blow that brought the end of the war within tangible reach. With the fall of Petersburg and Richmond, the Confederacy lost not only its political capital, but also the heart of its military and logistical structure in the East. Lee's retreat westward was only a last desperate maneuver to unite with other Confederate forces. But the loss of these two cities effectively sealed the fate of the southern states. Within a week, the war would end with the surrender at Appomattox. The siege and fall of Petersburg and Richmond exemplify how the war in the East transformed from a war of rapid movement into a lengthy process of attrition, and how ultimately the industrial and logistical advantages of the North were decisive. Surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. April 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse, a small town in Virginia, marked the symbolic and practically decisive final point of the American Civil War in the East. After the fall of Petersburg and Richmond, General Robert E. Lee had hardly any options left to continue the fight. His Army of Northern Virginia, once the backbone of the Confederate forces, was exhausted, decimated, and almost completely cut off from supplies. The hope of breaking through to the west to unite with the troops of General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina was Lee's last hope. The Union Army under General Ulysses S. Grant relentlessly pressured him, cut off retreat routes, and captured the few remaining railway lines that could supply the South. In the days before the surrender, the situation for Lee deteriorated dramatically. His men suffered from hunger, exhaustion, and lack of ammunition. Desertions increased, and every day brought new losses. On April 6, 1865, a severe defeat occurred at the Battle of Sailor's Creek, where a significant part of his army was captured. Nevertheless, Lee hoped to find urgently needed supplies at Appomattox Station. When his vanguard arrived there on April 8, however, it turned out that Union cavalry had already occupied the place and infantry was on its way to reinforce the position. On the morning of April 9, Lee attempted a final breakout. At first, the attack against the cavalry seemed to be successful, but soon fresh Union infantry units arrived and completely blocked the way. Lee realized that further fighting would mean senseless bloodshed. With this realization, he requested a meeting with Grant to negotiate the terms of surrender. The meeting took place in the home of Wilmer McLean, a man who, ironically, had seen the war begin near his property in 1861 at the First Battle of Bull Run, and now saw it end practically on his doorstep. The terms that Grant offered Lee were remarkably generous. The Confederate soldiers were to lay down their arms but were allowed to keep their personal belongings and horses to return home. No one was to be prosecuted for participating in the war as long as they complied with the laws of the United States. Lee accepted these terms, and the two generals shook hands, a moment that went down in history as a gesture of respect and reconciliation. The surrender at Appomattox did not mean the immediate end of all hostilities, but it sealed the fate of the Confederacy. Without Lee's army, the most important defensive line in the East, further resistance was futile. In the following weeks, the remaining Confederate armies also surrendered. April 9, 1865, thus became a symbol for the end of the bloodiest conflict on American soil and at the same time for the beginning of a new difficult phase, the reconstruction of the nation in the era of Reconstruction. Appomattox has since stood for the moment when bitter enemies were to become countrymen again, at least in theory. End of hostilities. In May 1865, the last cannons of the American Civil War finally fell silent. Although the surrender of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia on April 9 at Appomattox Courthouse had dealt the decisive military blow to the Confederacy, Confederate troops in other parts of the country still held out, partly in hope of a turn of events, partly due to a lack of clear orders. The end of hostilities was therefore not a single moment, but a process that dragged on for several weeks until the last Confederate units laid down their arms. The largest remaining force was under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. Only a few days after Lee's surrender, Johnston recognized the hopelessness of his situation. On April 26, 1865, he signed a formal surrender to General William T. Sherman near Durham Station, demobilizing around 90,000 soldiers, the largest surrender of the entire war. This step shattered the last coordinated military structures of the Confederacy in the East. But in the West, other garrisons and units still held out. General Richard Taylor, son of former U.S. President Zachary Taylor, surrendered on May 4 in Alabama. The most symbolic surrender, however, came a little later. On May 26, General Edmund Kirby Smith, Commander-in-Chief of the Trans-Mississippi Department, officially laid down his arms. His command comprised the vast territories west of the Mississippi, Texas, parts of Louisiana and Arkansas, which had been largely cut off from the main theater of war. With this last major surrender, the organized military resistance of the Confederacy ended. Nevertheless, smaller skirmishes and incidents occurred even after these dates, as some units or individual commanders received the news of the war's end late or refused to accept it. The last documented combat action of the war took place on May 12 and 13 at Palmito Ranch in Texas. Ironically, a Confederate victory which, however, had no strategic significance anymore. Shortly thereafter, these last units also dispersed. By May 1865, the armed resistance of the South was broken. The surrenders not only sealed the military end of the Confederate States of America, but also initiated the difficult transition into the post-war period. The war, which had cost hundreds of thousands of lives over 4 years and devastated large areas of the country, was now over. But the deep political, economic, and social divides it had left behind would occupy generations to come. May 1865 thus marked both the end of hostilities and the beginning of a new conflict-ridden era. Reconstruction. Assassination of Lincoln. April 14, 1865. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox began for Abraham Lincoln as a day of cautious hope. The president had just overcome the most severe crisis in the history of the United States and was faced with the task of reuniting a torn country. In the days before, he had spoken publicly several times about a mild, conciliatory reconstruction that should heal the wounds of the Civil War. But on this evening, he would become the victim of an assassination that plunged the nation into deep mourning again. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a well-known actor from a prominent theatrical family and a fervent sympathizer of the Confederacy. The defeat of the South filled him with anger and despair. Originally, Booth had pursued a plan to kidnap Lincoln to exchange him for captured Confederate officers. After the collapse of the Confederacy, however, this plan turned into the decision to assassinate the president, in the hope of increasing the chaos in the North and posthumously helping the cause of the South. Booth organized a conspiracy that was intended to simultaneously kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward, in order to destabilize the government. On the evening of April 14, Lincoln, with his wife Mary Todd and invited guests, attended a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. Booth, who knew the theater well, sneaked into the presidential box. Around 10:15 p.m., while the audience was laughing at a punchline, he stepped behind Lincoln, drew a small pistol, and shot the president in the back of the head from close range. Lincoln collapsed unconscious. Booth jumped from the box onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process, shouted "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," and escaped from the theater. At the same time, an accomplice, Lewis Powell, tried to assassinate Secretary of State Seward at his home but only wounded him severely. The attack on Vice President Johnson failed because the assigned assassin lost his nerve. Lincoln, however, was taken to the nearby Peterson House, where doctors tried in vain to save his life throughout the night. On the morning of April 15 at 7:22 a.m., he was declared dead. Secretary of State Stanton is said to have remarked at this moment, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of Lincoln's death triggered a wave of dismay and deep grief in the North. Millions mourned the man who had led the Union through its darkest hour. In the South, many reacted with mixed feelings. Between relief at the death of an opponent and the realization that Lincoln's mild Reconstruction plans would now likely give way to a harsher course. Booth himself was cornered and shot by Union soldiers in Virginia on April 26 after a nearly 2-week manhunt. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not only the first murder of a U.S. president, but also a tragic event that overshadowed the transition from war to peace. It snatched from the nation a leader who might have been able to make the reconciliation between North and South faster and less bitter. Instead, the Reconstruction era began under his successor, Andrew Johnson, in a climate of mistrust and political confrontation, a legacy that made Lincoln's death weigh even more heavily. Reconstruction era. With the end of hostilities in the spring of 1865, a phase began for the United States that was in many respects as contested as the Civil War itself, the Reconstruction era. It lasted from 1865 to 1877 and faced the enormous task of economically rebuilding the destroyed South, politically reintegrating the former Confederate states into the Union, and at the same time integrating millions of formerly enslaved African Americans into society. On paper, this seemed a historic opportunity to place the United States on a new foundation of freedom and equality. In reality, however, Reconstruction was a contradictory process, marked by deep conflicts which brought important progress but also laid the foundation for new forms of oppression. First, it was about legal reorganization. As early as December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery throughout the United States. Soon followed the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the USA, as well as the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote regardless of race or previous condition of servitude. These changes formed the foundation for legal equality, which was unprecedented in American history up to that point. This process was supported by the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency that provided former slaves with food, medical assistance, education, and support with labor contracts. Politically, Reconstruction was marked by sharp tensions. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, pursued a comparatively lenient course towards the former Confederates, which met with fierce criticism in the Republican-dominated Congress. The so-called radical Republicans wanted not only to reintegrate the South, but also to fundamentally transform it to break the political and economic power of the old planter aristocracy. This led to a phase of radical reconstruction, in which the South was divided into military districts, and the return of the Southern states to Congress was tied to strict conditions. During this time, African Americans experienced a phase of political participation for the first time in U.S. history. Black men were elected to local offices, to the state legislatures, and even to the U.S. Congress. Schools for African Americans were established in large numbers and a vibrant African American civil society developed. But this upswing met with bitter resistance. Many white Southerners who rejected the social change organized themselves into violent groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which tried to reverse the political and social emancipation of blacks through terror and intimidation. Economically, the Reconstruction remained difficult. The plantation economy was destroyed, and the system of slave labor was often replaced by tenancy and debt relationships, sharecropping, that kept former slaves in economic dependence. At the same time, the South began the slow construction of a more diversified economy, but poverty and inequality characterized the lives of many people, regardless of skin color. Reconstruction ended with the so-called Compromise of 1877, in which the Republicans, in exchange for the presidency of Rutherford B. Hayes, promised the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the South. With that, African Americans lost their most important protection against the restoration of white supremacy. In the following decades, many Southern states established a system of legal racial segregation with the Jim Crow laws, which largely nullified the political and social achievements of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction era was thus a paradox, a time of unprecedented reforms and hope, but also of the birth of new forms of discrimination. It laid the legal basis for equality, the realization of which, however, would take more than another century. Its legacy continues to this day as a reminder that legal changes alone are not enough to overcome deeply rooted social inequalities.